Two divers are conducting the first ever dive into a long underwater section of Agan Airworth Cave in South Wales. They're at the known limits of one of the UK's most complex caves, making an attempt to be the first to break through this flooded section of cave. It's a remote location. They've already dived through 3 underwater cave passages and crawled and walked through miles of dry cave to get to this location. They've dived as far as they can into this uncharted passage, and they've pushed their air supply to the limit when they find what they've been looking for. As they follow this bank leading up to the surface, they realize they've made a terrible miscalculation. This video is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that lets you easily compare how any story in the news is being covered. Instead of seeing only one source, Ground News shows you every article in one convenient place and lets you know the political point of view, factual accuracy, and the ownership of each media outlet, giving you tools to compare coverage and draw your own conclusions. For 40% off unlimited access, subscribe through my link, ground.news/waterline. The link is in the description. In the summer of 1974, Martin Farr and Roger Solari are looking to break ground by going further and deeper than anyone else into one of the most difficult and well-known caves in the UK. They're considered 2 of the best British cave divers of their generation. Martin Farr is a 23-year-old cave diver. He's been caving since he was 10 years old, and he's been cave diving for the last 3 years. At 23, he's already an accomplished exploratory cave diver, well known in the UK cave diving community. He's been diving with another caver and cave diver, Roger Solari, for the last 3 years. Solari's 24 years old, and the 2 divers have a similar level of experience. Solari's from the Forest of Dean, Gloucestershire, and he's been caving and diving since the age of 12. Roger Solari is a dedicated and rugged cave diver. He's known as an achiever. He regularly completes difficult caving expeditions, making further progress into caves and mapping out new underground routes. Together, they've found and explored miles of new caves in Wales and Ireland, making a name for themselves in the process. Farr and Solari want to push the limits in cave exploration, using their diving skills to reach the most dangerous and remote underground places they can. But it's not always easy for them to find their next challenge to further their reputation. During the early 1970s, the best caves are often earmarked by other divers. Another diver might have been to a cave first or made the most progress to date and put an unofficial stamp on it. Farr and Solari are frustrated by the number of prime exploration sites they can't claim for themselves. Their home area is in South Wales, and one of the best caves in the UK, Ogof Agan Airworth, is nearby. They want to explore this cave, but another caver by the name of John Parker is already exploring the cave system. Eventually, luck breaks their way. After a year of inactivity, they realize Parker's lost interest in exploring the cave any further. This opens the opportunity for Farr and Solari to continue the exploration of the cave from where Parker left off. The pair will push into Agan Airworth's terminal downstream sumps. Ogof means cave in Welsh. Ogof Agan Airworth is a cave system found in the limestone rocks of the Llangatock Escarpment in South Wales. It's located just west of the town of Abergavenny and near to the smaller town of Crickhowell. With over 20 miles of surveyed passages, it's the 4th longest cave in the UK. The cave was first investigated by a man named Brian Price in 1949 and 1950. It wasn't until 1957 that Hereford Caving Club broke through the cave's first boulder choke, which is a collection of rocks or rubble that obstructs the passage in the cave. Past this first boulder choke, the cave opens into a long and complex cave system with various routes to explore. It's got wide passages featuring pools, limestone formations, and flooded sections. As well as being a popular caving site, Agan Airworth is also an important bat roosting site, with several hundred rare lesser horseshoe bats going to the cave to roost every winter. After 1957, the next major exploration of Agan Airworth came when John Parker began diving into the cave's terminal downstream sumps. A promising section of cave which could offer miles of unexplored ground, but it's blocked to normal exploration by sumps or cave passages submerged underwater. They can be long or short, and they can be static with no flowing water or active with water continuously flowing through them. Parker, along with other divers, had been diving through the sumps in Agan Ayworth to try and push the known limits of the cave. After diving into a sump, cave divers often find they eventually surface into a new dry section of cave they can walk through. And Parker's found short, dry sections of cave between the sumps he's dived. On his last attempt, Parker makes it into sump number 3. His air supply runs short during the dive, and he doesn't make it to the end of the sump to see if it opens up into a new dry section of cave. Today, Agan Ayworth is a popular caving site, and for cavers who don't want to dive through the sumps, there's plenty to explore in the upper sections. To explore the cave, which goes by the nickname Aggie, cavers need a permit to get the entry key, and they have to sign in at the entrance to say which route they'll take in case they get lost. From what I understand, it's a challenging cave. The dry upper reaches could be a 6 to 8 hour round trip. Going through the cave's underwater terminal downstream sumps is another thing altogether, and an expedition like this would take some planning. Let's say one of the normal routes is 3 hours in and 3 hours out with a light backpack for water and food. Solari and Farr have to carry their dive kits and multiple cylinders into the cave. They can't carry all that kit on their own, so they need a group of people to help them, who in turn also need their own supplies. In May 1974, the pair are ready to go. They have everything planned, and they have a small group of friends joining them like Sherpas. These are caving friends who are excited to be part of the expedition and possibly learning as much as they can in preparation for leading their own expedition one day. Just before the expedition, Solari injures his knee. He can't make the mile-long, grueling passage known as the Southern Stream that cavers need to crawl and squeeze their way through to get to the terminal downstream sumps, and particularly not with all the equipment they need to carry. So for the first trip, they agree that Farr will go on his own. Farr will see how far he can get into the cave on this trip, and then they can continue the explorations together at a later date. It's not unusual for cave divers to dive solo. The reality is that as soon as you enter a cave to dive, you're effectively on your own or responsible for yourself, even if there are other divers in the expedition. I can imagine that Solari must have felt like he was missing out. They've been planning this together, and then through some bad luck, an injury forces Solari to sit on the sideline. On his last dive, John Parker was forced to turn around while diving Sump 3. Sump 1 and 2 are shorter than Sump 3, and Parker didn't have enough air to continue further into Sump 3 and make it back out through Sump 2 and 1 on the way back. He was just over 200 meters into Sump 3 when he decided to turn around. By my calculations, that's longer than Sump 1 and 2 put together. Can you imagine going through a long, dark underwater cave, hoping at every turn that the next one gets you to an air chamber? Nobody's ever been there before, and it just keeps going. At some point, I imagine you start to think it'll never end. As an explorer, you want to carry on, and as a rational person, you know you don't have enough air to just keep meandering through tunnels with no way of knowing when it'll end. Farr takes a number of extra tanks into this attempt through Sump 3. He wants to make sure he has enough air to keep going and find the end. Going into the water, he has no idea if he'll make it further than John Parker. I'm sure he was wondering how much further it would be, or if there's even an air pocket at the other end. It's possible there's just a dead end. At least he could mark the end of the cave. But maybe there's more, and that's the thrill. As he approaches the point that Parker turned around, he has to be asking himself how much further he needs to go to find out. It turns out not that far. Only 30 meters past Parker's limit, he breaks the surface. Sump 3 is 259 meters long. After he surfaces on the other side, he's the first person to discover a new dry section of cave. From the water, he shines his torch around the cavern and sees an enormous passage that disappears off into the darkness. He climbs out of the water, drops his diving kit, and heads into the cave. I can imagine it's the kind of discovery cave divers dream of making. He's the first person ever to go where he is, and Solari misses out on this exceptional discovery. There are long sections of wide open passage. It's easy to walk through with interesting limestone and rock formations. There are sections where he has to negotiate his way carefully through narrow rifts, and then there's dark, deep, partially flooded areas. This new section of cave carries on for 550 meters before the roof starts to dip. This is where Farr finds another underwater sump, Aegirnewath's sump number 4. Farr rejoins his expedition group and the team make their way back out of the cave to meet with Solari and then head on to the pub to celebrate. I'm sure that the celebration for Solari must have been bittersweet. Of course, he would be excited and even proud of his friend Farr, and at the same time absolutely devastated that he missed out. The two turn their attention to sump number 4. The next day they start planning the dive and probably spend a bit of time daydreaming about the cave that lies beyond. A month later, on Saturday the 15th of June 1974, Farr and Solari are back at Aegirnewath to continue their exploration. They'll dive together, but they'll operate as solo divers. As solo divers, they're responsible for their own actions, and either of them can turn back at any point, leaving the other to continue on their own. They set off into the cave with their diving equipment and a small team to help them carry everything they'll need, ready for a lengthy exploration. Cave diving in Aegirnewath's terminal sumps means taking your equipment through difficult dry sections of cave that are miles long before you even get to the underwater segments. They walk, climb, and at times squeeze their way through cave passages. Some are very narrow holes that a person can only just fit through. The team passes each item of equipment hand to hand through these tight passages. Between them, they must have over 100 kilograms of equipment to carry through the cave system just to arrive at sump 1. The support party goes as far as sump 1, and from there, Farr and Solari are on their own. At the start of their exploration, each diver carries 3 air tanks, a cave reel to spool out a line to navigate the underwater tunnels, and a pair of caving boots for the dry sections of the cave. The 3 cylinders should be enough air to allow them to pass through sump 1 and 2, then through sump 3 and into sump 4. They hope this will be enough air to get all the way to the back of sump 4, and then enough air for them to return through sump 4, 3, 2 and 1. In the dry cave between sumps 2 and 3, they each leave the 1 semi-depleted tank they've used to get to that point. These are small tadpole tanks, and they'll use them again on the dive out. They continue on into sump 3 with their remaining 2 tanks. The 259 meter long sump 3 passes uneventfully. When they surface, they put on their caving boots, they head into the 550 meter long section of cave that Farr recently discovered, and down towards the start of sump 4. Here they don't have the help of their friends to carry equipment. The going is hard, but it only takes them half an hour to get to the start of their next dive. They look down at the dark pool in front of themselves and get ready to enter the water. At this point, the 2 divers are in an extremely isolated location. They're miles underground inside a cave, and they're about to dive into a dangerous, unknown underwater cave passage. Rescue, even in a dry part of the cave in a place like this, is very difficult and would take a long time to reach them. If something goes wrong underwater, you're completely on your own. I can imagine they'd be feeling a good mix of fear and excitement. They decide, seeing as they're both making an exploratory dive, that for the first time ever in their partnership, they'll make the dive close together. Farr usually leads. The last time Farr dived on his own and made a monumental discovery, without his friend. They want to break the new ground together. I'm fairly sure that Farr wants his friend to experience that feeling of discovery as much as Solari wants it for himself. But they're still diving independently. If either diver feels uncertain at any point, they can turn back and leave the other diver to carry on alone. They swap their regulators onto their last full tank. The tanks they used to dive through sump 3 are no longer full. They'll still take them into the dive as reserve for an absolute emergency. Ideally, the reserve tank would have its own regulator, but these are young men just starting out in life and they don't have the budget for multiple redundancies. If they need air from the reserve tank, they need to use the regulator from their main tank. It's difficult to swap onto a reserve tank underwater. It's best done in an air pocket or at the other side of a sump, but the divers don't plan to be in a position where they have to use their reserve tanks. I found an article that mentioned Solari's tanks were slightly positively buoyant and he was underweighted. Aluminium tanks tend to be slightly positive, particularly towards the end of the dive when there's not as much air in them. Aluminium is lighter than steel. I'm guessing he had aluminium tanks. If your equipment is positively buoyant and you're underweight, as in you don't have enough lead on your weight belt to counteract the positive buoyancy, you end up having to fin or kick to swim down and stop yourself from bouncing along the ceiling of the cave. You're constantly engaged both mentally and physically. You use more air because you're actively swimming all the time, and because you're constantly thinking about not hitting the ceiling of the cave, it can add to your mental load. Far's tanks are said to be negatively buoyant. Steel tanks will always remain negative or sink. Unlike Solari, Far simply adds a little more air into his BCD and he's neutrally buoyant. In a cave, it's important to be neutral. You don't waste energy on swimming down and you have one less thing to cloud your mind, which allows you to concentrate on making the best decisions possible. Far typically dives first, followed by Solari. That's how their teamwork has developed. I'm not exactly sure why. It's possible that Far has more equipment or is slightly more experienced than Solari. Diving into Sump 4, Solari sets off first. I'd imagine that because Far dived solo into Sump 3 and discovered the incredible passageway between Sump 3 and 4, they now both want Solari to be first into the next cavern. Solari sets his caving line from his diving reel as he goes. They'll use the line to find their way in and out of the submerged tunnel. Solari has 122 meters of line and Far, who's following close behind him, is carrying a further 300 meters of line. Although it's guesswork, they're both anticipating the dive into Sump 4 will be long. After about 4 or 5 minutes, Solari starts signaling that he's having trouble with his sinuses. This often happens to Solari when he dives to depth. It's something he's had to deal with before. Far signals to him that if something's wrong, he should head back. But Solari seems determined and he continues further into Sump 4 ahead of Far, laying his line as he goes. The tunnel through Sump 4 angles downwards, and as Solari descends, his sinuses are squeezed tighter by the water pressure. Pain increases, adding to his discomfort and mental load. Far checks in with him to see if he wants to turn back, but he presses on. 120 meters from the start of the sump, Solari's cave line runs out. The empty reel is cut off and Far ties his line onto Solari's and then takes the lead. Far checks his depth gauge, which reads 15 meters of water depth. The passage ahead continues to descend further. The two divers realize it's going to be a long, deep dive. They press on, slowly pulling, swimming, and crawling their way through the underwater passage. Far looks at his pressure gauge and sees that he's about to reach his third limit. Cave divers follow the rule of thirds. 1/3 of air in your tank is for the way in, 1/3 for the way out, and 1/3 as reserve for an emergency. It's a simple rule. You dive for 1/3 of your tank and then turn around and go back. If you dive half your tank and then run into a problem that slows you down, you won't have enough air to get out in time. Keeping 1/3 of your air in reserve is a safety measure. Far knows he should turn back within a few minutes. He also knows Solari, who has slightly smaller tanks, will have slightly less air than he does. Far carries on after reaching his third limit. A couple of minutes pass, but Far decides he'll push on just a little further. He signals to Solari that he's going to carry on and Solari should turn around if he needs to. He assumes Solari will turn back. Solari's an experienced and responsible diver and he should make the sensible choice. After signaling to Solari, Far turns to continue what he thinks is a solo exploration into Sump 4. I have this infuriating sense that Solari is determined not to miss out on the next discovery. I've seen this in other cave divers who seem fixated on their objective. Solari has buoyancy and sinus problems that add to his mental load. The passage continues to descend to 21 meters deep, and about 30 meters later, Farr sees a steep gravel bank through the murky water and it's heading upwards. He hopes it ascends to an air pocket, or better yet, another cavern. He looks at his pressure gauge. He's down to almost half a tank of air. He knows it's dangerous to carry on. To me, it's quite interesting to think about what goes into making a decision to turn back. Solari and Farr have been planning this for months. If he turns back now, who knows how long it'll be until their next attempt? Will someone else push in line and make the next major discovery? It's taken all their equipment to get here. If the expedition had more equipment at base camp, more tanks, then the decision to turn around would be easier to make. Farr has already made one major discovery, and there's probably a bit of pressure on him to continue to make further discoveries. So there's a huge incentive to push a little further. And besides, if he finds air, he'll have time to stop and rest. He'll have time to clear his mind, and then he can quickly follow the cave line back to the incredible cavern he discovered on his previous attempt. I'm sure the allure of discovering another large cavern also plays a part. He speeds off up the gravel bank, hoping to find air at the top. As he ascends, it still looks like the gravel bank will continue to the surface. He checks his depth gauge, 1 meter of water. He's just below the waterline. He searches for an air pocket, following the cave further. Farr is so close to the surface of the water that he can reach out and touch it, but all he finds is the ceiling of the cave, just below the water level. He looks to his right and sees the top of the cave extending out at the same level, with no air in sight. He decides to double down on what's already a gamble. He swims in the direction he's looking, hoping the top of the cave will angle upward into an air pocket. He continues along the ceiling of the cave. Instead of ascending, the cave dips into an alcove, and after less than 10 meters, he hits a vertical wall. Farr's in trouble. There's no air. He looks at his pressure gauge and he's got less than half a tank left. He's got his reserve tank from Sump 3, but he wants to avoid swapping his regulator underwater if he can. Swapping a regulator from one tank to another underwater is difficult and dangerous, but worth considering in a tight spot. Best to be avoided. Today, serious cavers won't dive without multiple redundancies and a regulator on each tank. And he needs the reserve tank to get him back through Sump number 3. He really needs to make it back using the air in his primary tank. The stress of the situation is building, and Farr finds it difficult to think clearly. He prepares to head downwards and then up the passage that leads back to the start of the sump as quickly as he can. And then, as he turns to make his exit, the unthinkable happens. He sees Solari, higher up than him, on the ceiling of the passage looking for air. He never turned around. Farr swims over to Solari and signals they have to get out of the sump. Solari doesn't sign anything back. Farr's signal is clear enough. Farr drops his cave reel off to the side for Solari to follow and speeds down the line in front of him. He reaches the deepest point at the bottom of the gravel bank. He descends rapidly and doesn't equalize his ears properly on the way down, and now he's in serious pain. His head is reeling with a mix of stress and pain and physical exertion from scrambling to get through the tunnel, but he has to keep moving. For the next several minutes, he crawls and swims through the murky water back up the tunnel, trying to be as fast and methodical as possible while working to keep his breathing even so that he doesn't waste what little air he has left. He continues back up the line he laid from his reel, and just before the point where his line is tied to Solari's 122 meters from the cavern and fresh air, he stops. He decides to wait to make sure Solari is following. It feels like he's there for a long time, but he waits nonetheless. He's only there for a minute, a very long minute. He's still over 120 meters from the start of the sump. His primary tank is almost empty. He thinks about heading back to look for Solari, but he knows he doesn't have the air reserves to go back down the tunnel. He has to get out. He continues back to the surface, trying to stay as calm as he can, all the while dealing with a pounding headache. Farr resurfaces at the entrance to Sump 4. The moment he breaks the surface, he feels an incredible sense of relief. The pain in his ears is excruciating and he's got a severe headache. He stands in the pool with his head in his hands for what he thinks is around 5 minutes, wondering if he's seriously injured himself. I can't find any reference to it, but I think there are two things at play. Yes, he's put some pressure on his eardrums, which can be incredibly painful. I think he's also overexerted himself and he's been skip breathing to conserve air. Skip breathing is holding your breath for short periods. Underwater, the pressure increases, and so the effects of carbon dioxide when you hold your breath can give you an intense headache. Eventually, the reality of the situation and the events of the previous 30 to 40 minutes start to sink in. He's standing alone in the pool. Solari's still inside the sump. All he can do is sit and wait for his friend to surface. Thoughts about what could have happened, and by this point what probably has happened to his friend, torment him. There's nothing he can do but sit on the bank and wait. He looks at the surface of the water, hoping to see the line twitch. A group of frothy bubbles rotates lethargically, quietly moving around on the surface of the water. Farr considers re-entering the water to search for Solari. After an agonizing wait, Farr realizes it's been several hours. It dawns on him that there's no point staying where he is. He decides to at least try to make a short examination of the first section of the sump. He's desperately low on air, and this will mean going back into the water using the tank he needs to get him back out through the 259-meter Sump 3. He decides he'll go in and have a look anyway. He puts on his gear, walks into the water ready to dive. Almost certainly now to find what will be his friend's lifeless body. He pulls gently on the line to make it taut before he heads in. He doesn't want to get tangled up in a loose line, but when he pulls, he realizes the line is slack. He pulls on it again to make it taut. The line just comes in as he pulls, and he realizes there's something wrong with it. It's not tied to anything. He can't dive along a loose line, so he carries on pulling it in. When he pulls in 130 meters of line, just past the knot where the two lines are joined, near the point in the sump where he stopped and waited on his way out, he finds the line has been cut with a knife. When Solari was making his way back out of the tunnel, he must have become entangled with the line and had to cut himself free, quite close behind Farr. In the act of cutting himself free, he probably lost his sense of orientation and got lost in the tunnel. All the time he spent entangled meant he simply ran out of air. He can't have made it anywhere from that point with so little air. Farr realizes that his friend is dead, and there's nothing he can do about the situation. Farr collects his things and heads back up the tunnel, getting ready to dive the 3 sumps that stand between him and the exit of the cave. After Farr and his team get out of Agan Aywath, a rescue operation is launched. The first attempt, launched soon afterwards, is postponed because of poor underwater visibility. A second attempt is made 5 days later with John Parker, but he only gets a short distance into Sump 4. He doesn't find Solari's body. Further search attempts are made, and in total 2,760 man-hours are spent looking for Roger Solari. Despite these efforts, his body isn't found. 7 years after the incident in 1981, Farr makes another dive into Agan Aywath Sump number 4. He found the experience traumatic. He makes it 215 meters into the cave without finding an air pocket before he retreats. He doesn't find Solari's body. Another 5 years later, in 1986, 2 divers, Ian Rolland and Julian Walker, make a significant advance into Sump 4. They find Roger Solari's body 220 meters into the sump, just past Farr's previous limits. But it's too dangerous to retrieve the body when they're already short on air in such an extreme, remote location. They leave Solari's body and it remains inside Sump number 4 to this day. Martin Farr went on to become a world-renowned cave diver, breaking records and taking part in groundbreaking dives. Today, he teaches cave diving and has written several books about his experience. I'll leave a link to his book about this dive down below. And a special thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Ground News is an app and website that lets you easily compare how any story in the news has been covered. Instead of seeing only one source, Ground News shows you every article in one convenient place and lets you know the political point of view, factual accuracy, and the ownership of each media outlet, giving you tools to compare coverage and draw your own conclusions. For 40% off unlimited access, subscribe through my link in the description, ground.news/waterline.